Now it is a great honor to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Shabazz is a professor of history and Africana studies in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His book, Advancing Democracy, African Americans and the Struggle for Access and Equity in Higher Education in Texas, was the winner of the T.R. Fehrenbach Book Award. The 40 Acres Documents, a volume he co-edited, was one of the earliest scholarly works in the modern movement for reparations for slavery. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Shabazz.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Right, please don't mind that I sit down and just hopefully have a nice informal conversation. I have a few things I'll offer about my journey on this subject of reparations, with my research and writing, but then really to hopefully prompt a really good conversation today is what I really hope to do. I want to thank Racial Justice Rising for this invitation. I have followed some of the work of mass slavery apology and other work over the years, particularly that I've been here in the Valley. It's a little over 12 years now. And I see this as part of a lot of what I've seen as part of phase one of the arc of justice we try to commit ourselves to, we try to work. ARC, the first step is acknowledgement, to acknowledge the pain of slavery, to acknowledge the problems it has created, not only historically, but that lead down to today. Second step is an arc, is redress, and the third step is compensation. And so the way we're looking at within the reparations movements today looks at all phases, and in that first step of acknowledgement, the apologies, the efforts to get this country, to get our communities, to get all of us to really acknowledge the problem and to acknowledge the crime and to acknowledge the wrong that slavery has wrought is a really first and crucial step. But I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of this arc of justice that we're aiming for and fighting for. Just want to also acknowledge a few folks in the room as well. My sister Kathleen Anderson, would you raise your hand? Kathleen is co-chair of the New England region for the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, in COBRA, we call it for short. In COBRA is a spearhead, one of the leading organizations in the reparations movement, in the modern reparations movement that came about through the leadership of a man named Imari Obadele, and a woman named Janita Scott Obadele. They were some of the first founders of in COBRA, and I'm honored to have worked with both of them on putting together this little book called The 40 Acres Documents. What did the United States really promise the people freed from slavery? I write the introduction, and then we have basically 4 documents in there. The field order, the famous or infamous, depending how you want to look at it, field order of William Tecumseh Sherman, that field order 15, that was one, it was really where a lot of that language of 40 acres and a mule comes out of that military field order as they moved in and captured areas that were part of the Confederate States of America, would turn over, particularly the Port Royal experiment, as it's called, in South Carolina. We also have in there documents from Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. We have, as a kind of counterpoint that's important to analyze, the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau bill by Andrew Johnson, in which we have one of the first kind of arguments against any form of reparations, any form of redress for slavery. And this is in real time, while when people say, well, what happened? Why didn't you get it? Why didn't you fight for it? Well, there are real reasons why. There are historical reasons why, no less than the first president to be impeached, Andrew Johnson. He provides a lot of argument. And take it for what it's worth, but it's worth reading, it's worth analyzing. And then we have documents that were gathered by congressional testimony where the Congress, members of Congress, went out into down south and interviewed leaders, people who, coming out of enslavement, asking them, what do you want? What would make things right? What do you really want? And particularly, we have the words of Henry Adams, a leader of a particular committee of freed people who expressed what it is they were seeking, and they were looking for reparations, particularly reparations in the form of land where they could be away from their oppressors and their former slave masters, and live like free people and develop themselves. And so we put that together as a way of beginning to study this question of reparations for slavery, and so I put it there. In the introduction, part of what I take things back is just to a snapshot of what did the United States look like in 1860. Look at the demographics, look at the numbers of white Americans versus African Americans, look at, within African Americans, the number of who were enslaved and the numbers who were free. Of that 4 million to about 400, a little under 400,000 that were technically free, and where folks were situated, and essentially what I argue in that is that we didn't get reparations back then because we didn't have the power to take them. Reparations is not something anybody gives you. It's something you have to demand, you have to be able to take, okay? And the other side comes to a point where they say, yes, we've got to do this. We've got to acknowledge, we've got to make a redress, and we must make compensation because of, they acknowledge that's the better course of action to take, okay? For example, a modern case of reparations, Japanese Americans. These are citizens of the United States. War occurs, the Pearl Harbor happens, the U.S. goes to war, and then preemptively, in California, they open up internment camps and just pick up Japanese Americans. No issue of whether they've done anything disloyal, no issue except that they're Japanese. They round them up and put them in internment camps with devastating consequences to individuals, to their families, to their reputations, to their psyches. Devastating effects. Didn't do that to Italians. We went to war with Italy. We went to war with Germany. Didn't go grab up every American of German descent and throw them in prison. Not even recent arrivals, let alone those that had been here longer, but even recent. They didn't go grab every German American and just preemptively put them in internment camps. Federal government didn't do that to Italians. They did it to Japanese. At war's end, for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's no talk about, well, what we did to those, acknowledgement that what we did to our Japanese American citizens was who had expressed no disloyalty, there's no reason to have done this, was wrong, and it just went on. And people had to just deal with it. into the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s. And in the 80s, under actually Ronald Reagan, who'd been governor of California in the 60s, but nonetheless part of that state, and it's wrong. He's the one that signs it, signs the legislation passed by the Congress to give every Japanese American who experienced the internment camps check of over $20,000 each. One of my good friends, a woman I was blessed to get to know during the 80s, had testified. Her and her husband had testified and had been part of that fight. A woman named Yuri Kochiyama and her husband Bill. These were close friends of the Shabazz family, Malcolm X and Amilcar Shabazz and Betty Shabazz. Close friends, close comrades, and they had fought, and they got it. There was the acknowledgement of the wrong of that. There was redress, there was compensation. And many of the problems and issues that people will raise against reparations, people could have raised it against that, but again, decision was made. And a lot of it had to do with, in the 80s, Japan had become a really powerhouse economy, I think second only to the United States. Its economy was a real force. And they wanted to, it was a part of a way of signaling and trying to improve better relations with the Japanese. Japanese had things they were struggling with around the American base in Okinawa and different kinds of issues they were fighting for. And so this was a very important gesture, both domestically to address the wrong, but then also a convergence of international interests to address that. So with these parallels, many of us have looked in the modern movement, began to look at these struggles, look at what was done, and began to raise the questions: why do we allow the fact that our ancestors in the 1860s did not have the numerical, the political power? There wasn't a convergence of international factors to enable them to demand and to receive reparations. Is it over? Do you just have to say, well, we couldn't do it then, the moral point of it is lost? Well, some of us said no. There's still a moral point to do it, and there's still very practical reasons to do it. And so we've moved from there. But from my end, as someone trained in history, as an historian, part of my effort has been to kind of look at some of the historical background of this. But it's interesting how, just as a coinky-dink, I'm from Texas. All my family, father's side, mother's side, all out of Louisiana. And in coming up in Texas, the best place in the world to go to school once you graduate high school was not Harvard, it was not Oxford, was not Yale or Cambridge or anywhere like that. It was the University of Texas at Austin. Clear, that's the only place in the world worth going. And and so for me, I was in that same kind of mindset, and that's where I trotted off to school at 17 years old. And when I got there, my major of choice was economics. I wanted to have a good degree that would enable me to understand economic policies, macroeconomic policies, because my dream, my vision was to have beaten Barack Obama to the White House. Barack Obama and I are about the same age, by the way. And there's no question about my birth certificate. I have it as Trump would raise, but I could easily prove it. Beaumont, Texas, born right there. And but I felt I was in a state with even bigger electoral college votes than where he made his political career in Illinois. The only thing is, to establish some record, and so I thought I would run for office, hopefully be the first black U.S. senator from Texas, and then go on to run for the White House, and would have been in there either right now or around the same time that he got there. But changed my mind, huh?
That would have been great.
That would have been great. Well, he beat me to it, and that's fine, because I actually gave up on the whole idea of going to, because when I'd finished my economics degree, my plan was to go to UT Law School, best law school in the world, and then from there start a political career, community organizing, political work immediately after. But in my economics degree, I was really blessed, really fortunate. 2 brilliant African Americans had just been hired the year I got there into the economics department. This man, William Darity, known to us as Sandy Darity, William Darity Jr., and another man named Samuel Myers, Sam Myers. They had just come out of their PhD programs at MIT. They were part of a really illustrious group of African Americans who had been admitted to MIT. They were 2 more on the left, Sam and Sandy. On the right was a guy named Glenn Lowry. And I've been a student of Glenn Lowry. I studied with Glenn Lowry one summer at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. So I had the right and the left of that illustrious group. And but Sandy really gave me a lot of attention and really steered me. And one of the things he attacked was my interest of going to law school. He said he wouldn't even write a letter of recommendation. He didn't write letters. I want you to go to grad school, and I want you to go to grad school in economics. And so part of where I went to Northwestern, Sam and Sandy and others had pushed the American Economics Association, the largest academic professional association of economists, to develop to have a summer research opportunity program for minorities and interested in the field of economics. So just as I was finishing my sophomore year, rising to my junior year, they got me into that program. I spent 2 months in Evanston. It was at Northwestern because one of the professors, a little older than Sam and Sandy, another brilliant economist, a man named Marcus Alexis, was there. He actually wasn't there. He was head of the Interstate Commerce Commission under Jimmy Carter. This was under the Carter administration. And so he was on a leave from his appointment, but he still was faculty there, and he got Northwestern to house us and to provide space for the program. And so Marcus Alexis, Glenn Lowry, Sam Myers, Sandy Darity, these are all African American economists, all brilliant African American economists. And they began to really beat the whole idea of law school out of my mind. And then secondly, my roommate, my older cousin, had come to go to UT Law School. He graduated at Penn from the Wharton School, and he'd come down to go to UT, and we were roommates together for his first year and a half of law school. That really cured me. When I saw how just idiotic and low, mentality and even morality of these young law school students, it was just like, it's stupid. What am I going to go, just learn these different cases and regurgitate and no intellect. And they'd see my little books on the bookshelf, Sam, the Principles of Economics, the big textbook. I can't remember the guy's name, but Sam what?
Samuelson.
Samuelson, yes, I
read his stuff too.
I had my Samuelson there. I had my Schumpeter there I had my Marx. I had all volumes of Das Kapital and theories of surplus value. And they'd come to the house, his law school buddies, and see my stuff and while they're drinking, and then start arguing with me about how capitalism is the best and why are you critiquing capitalism. But I was really then kind of abandoned the whole politics and law school kind of thing. And but really in studying things at that time, Sandy was not sanguine and not into the case for reparations. And he says it actually in this interview that it really, the whole thing kind of came as a surprise to him that how the conversation has really opened up in recent years. But he has become a real proponent. He has done some very extensive analyses, both showing how economically this could be done, how economically this could be beneficial for people of African descent in this country, but also for the country as a whole. And if you're interested in eliminating poverty and dealing with economic inequality. And he's proposed a number of different plans and means for, but by no means a blueprint, but just ideas he's put out there that are quite interesting and has driven a lot of conversation on this. He's testified before Congress around the bill that I personally endorse, have endorsed for a long time. It's now sponsored by my former Congresswoman, Sheila Jackson Lee, from when I lived in Texas. She is now the sponsor of it. I was recently with Congressman McGovern, and he is one of the 120 co-sponsors, supporters of the bill. Got to get a little bit more, to get a little more traction out of it, and to actually get it on the floor and try to get it passed. And of course, we'll have to see if it can trigger us, we wouldn't have much success in the Senate right now, obviously, but we got to have a long game for these kinds of, for this bill. This is a study bill. As you can read, it says to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery, its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. That's it. That's it. It calls for within it appropriation, a kind of an initial appropriation, depending on how it would be spent. There would be oversight, government accounting office of $12 million that could be used to begin to assemble a team of people to conduct the research. There's a timeline put to the research. There's certain parameters put to it. And like I say, there definitely would be government accounting office oversight for it. But this is the basis then of a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Okay? Doesn't commit to any particular plan, scheme, compensation methodologies, or anything. Just to study it, make a report that Congress and the American people could then study and try to grapple with from there, and what, in terms of where things might go from there, on the basis of this research effort. Okay, and so there have been hearings, there have been testimony, but really I think right now it's going to be a basis based on how the vote goes in coming elections. If some change in the Senate can occur, and of course holding the House and electing more people who in the House, that representatives that would be supportive of such a bill, and senators who would be supportive of such a bill, and then also who's in the White House, so that they don't veto it and then require an override. So that's our process, that's our political process. It's going to take some time to get to a place where we have enough people in the Senate and enough people in the House to approve such a commission and such a study, and then a president, someone in the White House that would be willing to sign it into law, that we could get started on it. But this is one basic step. I don't think it's all. I want to talk today about other things than this step, but at a federal government level, this is one basic step where we could move this along, and we need everyone's support. We need Massachusetts to find ways to lead the way. That's what I was speaking to Congressman McGovern about recently, and we'll be talking to him about it more. We need, and of course, There is discussion at the presidential, with presidential candidates. We need them behind this and to do what they can so that we can move this on the federal level. Like I said, I did go and I did look and see that McGovern is on board. But let's step back a little bit. And one of the things in looking is what are some of the objections to this. And again, the objections go back to the end of the Civil War, to the end of chattel enslavement and the passage of the 13th Amendment that ends the institution of slavery, except for prisons, except for those convicted of crimes thereof. But other than that, it ends the institution of slavery, and the questions emerged immediately. In fact, if you look at the history, one of the really compelling factoids were what were called the threat of the Christmas riots. So the treaty at Appomattox Courthouse is in April of 1865. The freed people were under the clear sense that by Christmas we're going to get some kind of reparations compensation. We're going to get something. We're going to be told where some land is we can begin to move to. We're going to be given some provisions. Something's going to be we're going to get some help. And folks were really looking, and somehow the word had spread, and historians have looked and tried to figure out why. I think it's because we like Christmas. And we figure that's as good a time as any. People are in a giving spirit, and maybe we're going to get what we're owed. And but concerns then went out that when December 25th rolls around, when late December rolls around, and there's no information coming, there's no check, there's no provisions, nothing is coming along those lines, things are going to turn sour, and whites then militias started saying, let's mobilize, let's be ready, because things might get ugly and we got to get ahead of it. It actually did not, that December of 1865 was not as bloody or as all these fears, if you go back and you read in the record, as some of the hyperbolic fears were going at that time. But it still, the research shows there was a strong sense among the free people of that they had been wronged by slavery, that wrong was going to be acknowledged, not just in terms of the constitutional amendment, that's cleaning up a document. That's not really acknowledging you've done a wrong to me. That's just cleaning up the legal document that establishes American citizenship, right? But it's not acknowledging to a people that what that amendment is ending was an act that was wrong and that you deserve something to make things right. Moving from the Christmas riots, or the threat of Christmas riots, of course, what does emerge as, and Du Bois writes about this eloquently in The Souls of Black Folks, spends a whole chapter on it, what does emerge as the one federal government effort is the Freedmen's Bureau. It's a long name to it. It has the Freedmen's Bureau of Abandoned Lands. These are lands where the slave owners who went into rebellion and fought in the rebel army. The view was they had abandoned their property by doing that, and that these lands would be confiscated, and that this would be part of a redress. A scheme of redress is to then redistribute that land back to the people who had worked that land and received no compensation for their labors. So there was then this Freedmen's Bureau. And Du Bois gives a very rich and compelling account of what it accomplished, what its limitations were, and ultimately why and how it went out of existence. Didn't last very long. One of the great leaders of it, the man put overall to head it, who had been in the military in general, is the person for whom Howard University is named for, Jennifer Oliver O. Howard. And he's put in charge, and they set up agents all over where the enslaved, formerly enslaved people lived, all through the 13 Confederate areas, states and areas, and set up these bureaus to assist in a whole range of things. One, making sure people get justice, making sure that in cases, in legal disputes, over land, over contracts, because now we're switching to a wage labor system, over whatever the issues might be, that truly fair, impartial courts could be established to deal with legal disputes between formerly enslaved and former enslavers and whites in the area. Also building schools. Also providing for just cases immediately where people are hungry and starved. How do you provide rations? And so there's a whole range of things it was put on its docket, was put before these bureau and these bureau agents, and ultimately they just by limitations of size, of scale of the program, of funding, which was always threatened and had a very short life, and then had to come up for renewal about 1 year or 2 years after it was just getting started, had to come up for renewal, and there's all these debates. Is it even going to continue? And then there's vetoes, and then they have to override Johnson's veto. It's a troubled kind of situation, but the one area of some success, undisputed, is that it did help to get public schools, public system of education established in the South, which profoundly benefited African Americans, formerly enslaved African Americans. It actually benefited everybody because there hadn't been much of a public school system. The whole thing that grows out of this state with Horace Mann Bond and the normal school there at Westfield, we call Westfield University today, and the movement that spread out from Massachusetts to create laws compelling, making it compulsory that children up to at least 14 certain age had to go to school, that schools had to be set up on the public dime to provide that compulsory schooling, that it be administered and have public community oversight and leadership, that it have a curriculum designed to make us all Americans. That idea growing right out of Massachusetts in the 1840s didn't get very far down south. Didn't get very far at all. And so coming out of the Civil War, what they had is they would give poor vouchers to the poor. Basically, if you really wanted your child to get an education, they would have a pauper relief and monies for paupers, and so your child would be declared a pauper. Today, I think we call the language free and reduced lunch, but so that they can get a meal at school. But in those days, they called it being a pauper. And so as a pauper, you would be supported to go to a private school if you were really insistent on going to school. If you didn't want to go, you just didn't go. You could run the streets or run the river like Huckleberry Finn, right? And his buddy N-word Jim, okay? And hang out in the woods and go do your thing. Or you could get a job, you could go be working in the mines or working somewhere, but you didn't have to go to school. And that persists all the way down throughout vast parts of the South, inclusive of white people, until the late 1800s, until almost the 1900s. Before you really have truant officers and folks really getting tough and making compulsory education really compulsory. But driving that, Du Bois argues, one factor was the push of the freed people for schooling for their children. That drags the whole South along toward a system of free public education. Just a point on that. And the impetus for that, the institutional impetus, is the Freedmen's Bureau. That's one area where that federal program was moderately successful, was in the way that it pushed to help set up schools. All its other areas, redistributing land, courts, not too successful at all. Just didn't have the numbers, didn't have the administrative, the financial backing. Again, this is when the first Klan rises, right after the Civil War. There are areas where guerrilla warfare against any kind of movement of this anti-racist movement in the South is fought. They're guerrilla fighters fighting it. So it's a terrible time. It's a violent time. Reconstruction and then ultimately with redemption in 1877, power is given right back to the rabid racists, right back to the white supremacists. Troops are pulled out. No more Freedmen's Bureau. No more federal support for anything for free people, and you're left at the mercy of the very bitter, lost cause people that had formerly enslaved you. And things get progressively worse and worse and worse. And the whole meaning of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments by the 1890s is completely gutted, completely eviscerated. By the time you get the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, that just sort of ratifies that that the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection of the law to everybody here can allow Jim Crow, can allow for the dominant whites to segregate and to separate out black people from involvements in aspects of society, all from schooling to hospitals to everything, to the parks, to the sidewalks. They could be legislated against, they could be Jim Crowed, and it's perfectly legal because we can be separate as long as things are equal. And what is equal? It's what the dominant oppressor says it is, and we're not going to bother to investigate it very much. And so the importance in that House bill to even then go beyond just reparations for slavery is important, because what happens is that the inequality, the inequality, the unequalness that existed under slavery is resumed. It resumes, certainly after 1877. So that little window of trying to move the country to make an acknowledgement of the wrong, to redress the wrong, to compensate for the wrong, that little window between 1866 and 1877 is it. And that was fraught enough, but you were at least talking about it, you passed laws about it, you had civil rights acts, you had Freedmen's Bureau down there trying to get started with something. That's your window, but by 1877, it's all kaput. It's all gone. No troops to back it, no federal government dollars to back it, no, and ultimately by 1896, the even legal framework, you've been cleared that it's fine to reinstall white supremacy openly. To openly reinstall. And if you ever read some of the accounts of politicians in the 1890s so-called age of populism, The language is right out there. We are the superior race. Government, is created to maintain that and to enforce that and to develop that domestically and internationally. It's very clear, it's very open. So our little moment, Du Bois calls it in his book, Black Reconstruction, it's this little moment in the sun where the arc of justice, there's sunlight and things are looking like we're trying to go somewhere. It closes. It closes by 1877, and that's the end of it. That's the end of it. That's the end of it in one way, but that's the beginning then of a new round of struggle, what we call the freedom struggle in this country. And that freedom struggle has continued unabated, and the language of reparations has been in that freedom struggle all the way throughout. So in the timeline, an interesting timeline we have on the UMass website, this historical timeline by Alan J. Davis, one of our alums, he points out many of some of the things that I've mentioned, the importance of the field order, the Southern Homestead Act, and other different, very interesting points from different literature, different books like Race, Racism, and Reparations. So, but there are a few things we could fill in because between 1878 and the 1969 Black Manifesto, there are many other interesting things. One I'd like to bring up from the 1890s is the idea of a pension fund for the formerly enslaved. A white Southerner comes up with an idea that all formerly enslaved ought to be given a pension by the federal government. And his belief is, because there are all kind of these panics and economic crises going on, and especially hard in the South, because it's still fighting to get its economy back up and going after the Civil War. And he feels like if we got that federal money for these formerly enslaved niggers, as he would say, they're going to have to spend it with the white people. So it would be an economic boost. This is, in other words, this is sort of like an Obama TARP stimulus program for white Southern capitalists, right? For white people, and but just passed through black people in the form of pensions for their having formerly been enslaved. Not able to make any money, not able to put anything away for their old age. Let's help them out, and we'll get this pension program. And he offers it as a bill, and there's efforts. It doesn't really go anywhere. But so the argument goes, about a year after he had come up with this idea and started picking it up, a woman named Callie House, who had been formerly enslaved herself, who believed she herself was entitled to an old age pension as a person formerly enslaved, and as well as others. And so she organized created one of the first organizations to fight for reparations and to push for this bill. She was the leader of the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association. Born in 1861, Rutherford County, Tennessee. She lived till 1928. And this organization, at its height, would involve hundreds of thousands interested in that reparations effort. As with others who began to become prominent at the national level, like Marcus Garvey, federal government's going to bust her. And she will be tried for supposedly her organization was using the mail to commit fraud by telling people that you're entitled to this pension, please send some support to help the ex-slave, mutual relief. We're doing work to get you your pension. Please send some support. You know, organizations need funds to live. And so this became used against her to charge her. It says, newspapers of the time ridiculed her efforts. The federal government attempted to arrest her and other leaders of the association. In 1916, U.S. Postmaster General A.S. Burleson sought indictments against leaders of the association, claiming that they obtained money from by fraudulent circulars proclaiming that pensions and reparations were forthcoming. And she served time in a Missouri penitentiary from November 1917 to 1918 for fighting for reparations. She died from cancer in Nashville, Tennessee, and passed on at the age of 67. There are other not quite as large or quite as prominent efforts as Callie House that also occur in the early 1900s. And then, of course, the Garvey movement is one of our really large movements. And as part of Garvey's message was a sense of how do we redress the wrong that has occurred to us and how do we organize for self-determination. But these movements would ultimately really focus on the call for reparations again going into the 40s. And prominently, Paul Robeson is a part of making an international case. Also, a woman named Queen Mother Moore rises to really put out the language of reparations as part of her demands for justice. And she's from out of Louisiana, like my family. And it's interesting, in the 20s, of all the states in the United States, Louisiana had the largest number of chapters and the largest number of people who were part of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey's organization. And I guess certain consciousness in Louisiana during those times. But and then we come into the 60s, and we have prominently the case of, and we're sitting, as we sit here in a church, the Black Manifesto was launched by a man named James Foreman. He was came out of something called the National Black Economic Development Conference. And what that conference, and under the leadership of James Foreman, argued is that white Christian churches and Jewish synagogues were part and parcel of the system of capitalism, that they should begin to pay reparations to black people in this country, and it demanded $500 million from Christian white churches and Jewish synagogues. One of the ways in which one of the churches that did give some interest to this, I think, was United Church of Christ. And let's see if we got that right. And well, it says here about $215,000 was raised from the Episcopalian and Methodist churches through rancorous deliberations that ultimately tore the coalition apart. And but then this also led to set the stage for the coming of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. Some of the folks active in that had been a part of that work, such as Imari Obadeli. He was definitely knew James Foreman and knew a lot about some of that efforts. But another important piece is the book by Randall Robinson, The Debt. Brought a lot brought the question of reparations back to the fore and focused a lot of attention on it. And so we've been just working steadily in Cobra, others with this, making these arguments, and then most recently the essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates really then helped to involve millions of people in the United States into thinking about these issues once again, and thinking about, again, that arc of justice, the acknowledgement of wrong, of the wrongful taking of slavery and of its aftermath, the redress, and the question of compensation. And so I want to just go from there to really open up and go dialogic at this point. What are some of your thoughts, some of your questions? I think we got a microphone if you want. Oh, thank you. Right here? It's wireless? Okay, you're going to do the Oprah thing. 1, 2, 3.
Du Bois, it's
It's on. I hear you.
Du Bois has spent a lot of pages discussing Booker T. Washington's proposals, and he seemed to be on both sides of the idea of blacks learning to be mechanics. I just wonder what your...
So, you know, we have the Du Bois papers at UMass in our Du Bois library. We've digitized them. They're all online. You can see facsimile reproductions of all of his papers. And there's actually in there the famous letter that he writes Booker T. Washington after what's known as the Atlanta Cotton Exposition address. This address that he gave that catapulted him to national prominence. He was a great orator, Booker T. Washington, and at that Atlanta address before a white crowd and then blacks were way in the back, he gathers there and he had a great voice, and he intoned, "Unto all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers of the hand. But in all things essential to mutual progress, we shall be united as the fist." That became the Black Power salute. Black Power, Black Power. And the crowd jumped up, the accounts in the papers of that day. White people threw over tables, they roared, excitement. The blacks were in the back like, damn, he turned these white people on, man, look at him. Oh, man, the accounts were tremendous. And the word went out that since the death of Frederick Douglass, black people now had a new national leader in this young man from West Virginia, now an educator in Tuskegee, Alabama, who had built a school, was building a school out of a chicken coop. He had cleaned out the chicken shit and started from that humble beginnings, had the kids come there, learn how to make the bricks themselves, build the buildings, brick by brick. So they're learning masonry. They're learning the value of hard work. You'd get up in the morning at Tuskegee Institute before sunrise, just like in slavery days. Can't see in the morning till can't see at night. And your school starts going out working, slopping the hogs, taking going out to the field, doing all the work, then maybe some skilled work, learning brick masonry, building some building on the campus, plowing fields, And then when the sun's starting to go down, then you come in and you're supposed to wash up, clean up for chapel service, and then a little bit of instruction. That was your school day. Kids were going there because they're hearing supposedly a great school, and all they're doing is working. They're like, well, we get some education, man. We're going to learn how to read. I need some help. I'm here to get educated. We don't care about all that Latin and Greek and, a little liberal arts school. That's not what you need to learn a skill. You need to learn the value of hard work. There's a lot of character training. Then you go to chapel, you have night school, and night school is all this how to use a toothbrush. The value of being cleanly and hygiene and good character, moral hygiene, and very little actual instruction. And you'd be doing that for years before, you'd finish some kind of program or normal certificate to then go out and teach that same methodology in the schools. And so, but it was heroic because you're living in a time, 1890s, where we're going to the lowest point of black people in this country. Worse than slavery. Because at least in slavery, you were loved enough and appreciated enough because you're making them rich. But now, you're not even loved for the profits you're making. You're despised. You're considered like this blight everywhere you are. People don't want to sit next to you in a bus, on a streetcar. They don't want to be next to you. You paying the same value for a ticket to go to the opera, and they don't want to have to sit next to you. You got to sit up in the crow's nest. I mean, you're vilified everywhere. The cartoons, the pop culture. The greatest form of mass entertainment is what? The minstrel shows. White people blacken up and exaggerated, representations of black people to make you people laugh at it and see how utterly different and black people are and inhuman they are from the rest of us. Oh man, it's a terrible time. So this man, getting some actual support from white people at the highest levels, presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes and all the different presidents, the big robber barons, the captains of industry, Carnegie, giving money, Julius Rosenwald. When they approached Julius Rosenwald and said, hey, we need help to build schools, he gives money. Never built not a single school ever built entirely on Rosenwald monies, by the way. Rosenwald would give a little boost once he saw the project. You'd have to submit the project. Here's how far we've gotten. If we could just get a little extra cash, we can finish this off. And in no school did he ever provide more than 15% of the total cost of what it took to build the school. But we call it Rosenwald schools. And we're very generous for what we got from it. Thank you very much. But the real labor of it was black people themselves. What James Edison called double taxation. Because they're paying taxes, those that have property or in some form they're paying, but then they don't get decent schools for their equal schools. They have to then provide extra and raise money and provide the labor to build the better school, to build the schools themselves. It's a terrible time. And so for this man to begin to get some kind of traction that education is okay, education is good, albeit it's this very moral, character building kind of education, but just the idea, education is good for blacks. And he's getting support for that from white Southerners especially. Even Du Bois had to write him a congratulatory note. We have the actual copy. Thank you. I hear from what I read. You gave such a wonderful address, manly address, or whatever. But then by 1903, when he publishes Souls of Black Folks and the particular essay that forms chapter 3 of Booker T. Washington and others, he criticizes. So from mid-1890s with the Atlanta Exposition Address. He praises them, but by 1903, he's criticizing. Because what he says is that, of course, all blacks are not, for many of them, the idea of liberal arts education doesn't hold enough for everybody. We got to have a range of things. And so for some of our folks, yes, they'll go in more vocational areas, but they still ought to be literate. They still ought to have basic rudiments of education, even if they're going on into vocational tracks. By the way, until well into the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s even, schools in the South were on what was called split session. When the cotton crop was in, even if it's school time, school lets out for blacks. Until the crops is brought in. When it's time to plant, school is let out. And so the actual 180 day of school, black people never had that in the South because of split session. Didn't even have enough days to get a real education. So the changes, the push, the success that Washington seemed to be having initially was supported, but then Du Bois criticizes when he sees that Washington is not taking that little initial support and then leveraging it to expand. That in fact, his model, the so-called Hampton-Tuskegee model, is now pervading, has become this pervading idea over all schools, even in cities, even in urban areas. They're opening up Booker T. Washington schools, George Washington Carver schools, and they want to dumb down the curriculum and provide no opportunity for full, equal education for black children. And when he saw that that was where, on a policy level, this whole thing, Hampton-Tuskegee model and Washington's model was going, he then says, no, I've got to criticize. And it was a bold step. We even have the letter where he writes Booker T. Washington asking him for a letter of recommendation. He's trying to get a really high-level position in Washington, D.C., and by that time, Washington is the gatekeeper. Everything goes through Washington for an okay. Federal government, big federal government job, private sector job. People are going to ask, well, what does Washington think? And Washington says, yes, 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 I'll do what I can. He actually writes a negative letter. I don't think his ideas are quite different, and yada, yada, yada.
And you have that.
We don't have the Washington letter, other folks do. Other folks have the Washington letter, but he didn't get the job, and we do know that. And then we have found the Washington's letter as well. So there was an animus between the two men. There actually had been a big meeting in Boston where it got into fist fight. It got into a real knockdown, drag out. And the real hothead, he was even hotter against Washington than Du Bois, was a man named Monroe Trotter, right out of Boston. And I mean, he was like, we gotta fight Washington stuff all together. Washington controlled a lot of the black newspapers. He was a quintessential ethnic boss. Like you have other ethnic groups with Boss Tweed and the Irish Mafia, the Italian Mafia, the other kinds of ethnic bosses who would then tell all the people in that group, here's who you go vote for. There's a Kennedy boy, go vote for the Kennedy boy. Everybody got to go out and vote for the Kennedy boy. Otherwise they get beat up. Well, he built that same sort of system of patronage. And if you kowtowed to Booker T. Washington on it, you could get little crumbs, little advantages, get a principalship of a black school or something like that. If you didn't, he could stamp you out. Yes.
I'd just like to hear your thoughts on, it's something I've been thinking about, is the benefits that'll accrue to people like me, white people, from the process of reparations.
Yes.
I think that's important.
Yes, very good. So, one of the reasons I've come to support and was early on a supporter is that I see from just the conversation around reparations all the way to actual policy implementation possibilities from reparations can go a long way to dismantling the crippling effects of white supremacy and white nationalism on white people. Now, I've been up here up north, but most of my life I've spent down south. And so I've known, I know a different kind of white folks than the average white Yankee. And for them, the sense of their whiteness is really something very essential, very essentialized. There was a bill put forward in Alabama, because Alabama's constitution, state constitution, 1901, is the longest constitution in the world. Because you never edit it, you just would amend it and amend it and amend it. And so all of the white supremacist, racist stuff from the 1901 is still there. One of them being, when I moved to the state in 1997, one of the things still in the Constitution is that it was a crime for a member of the black race, Negro race, whatever it said, and a member of the white race to be married or to cohabitate. Sex. It's a crime. And and it stipulated the fine and the incarceration, the punishment, for any person who would marry, any justice of the peace, any preacher who would marry an interracial couple, as well as the punishments of that interracial couple itself. It's all in there. 1901 Constitution. And it had never, so I'm there in 1997 and it's still on the books. Now you say, well, but it's as a matter of state law, state constitutional law, it could not be enforced because it had been nullified by what decision? You've probably seen the movie. Loving versus Virginia. Mid-1960s, Supreme Court ruled, SCOTUS ruled, all those kinds of state laws that make it a crime for black and white to be married are hereby nullified. Okay? So any state law enforcement going into somebody's home in Alabama, a black and a white, and saying what you're doing is against the law and hauling them down to jail, that would immediately be thrown out. The lawyers would get all over that, and it would go around the world. Look, Alabama's gone crazy, right? Because federal law trumped it. No pun intended. But it's still on the books. So a black legislator and a white legislator said, you know what? We amend the state constitution for all other kinds of things, commercial things, economic things. We ought to amend this, and you got to then go to the voters. So they passed it, the language through the state legislature. It then went on the ballot. And then the question became this was 2000, maybe 2001, is Alabama going to pass it? Are they going to pass this amendment making it lawful for black and white to be married in Alabama? To invalidate that provision of the 1901 Constitution that made it a crime. How are they going to vote? And there were pollsters out there. They were finding that it could be a very close vote. It could go either way. And this was my first time on national television. NBC sent a crew down to Alabama to discuss this impending vote, big vote. And they came to to the leading black public intellectual of Alabama, which ain't saying much, because we don't have too many intellectuals in Alabama at all. No. But they came, they asked me to be on it, and I went to Birmingham, and the crew filmed me in the Birmingham library, walking past, and then I sat in front of a bunch of old law books, and I basically told them, Kendrick, whatever his name was, that, you know, it's going to be a tough vote. Because part of it was, and they did some man on the street interviews, people on the street interviews, and amongst the whites, the word was, this whole legislation, this whole thing being on the ballot measure is just some effort by, and this is in private conversation, you know, the Jews and the niggers, to make Alabama look bad, to make us look so racist. And we ought to just, for the heck of it, vote against this thing. It still would have no legal effect one way or the other. But if we could just get people to vote against this, this is on the radio, this is on your, you know, right after Rush Limbaugh's show, you know, some local person that's coming on would talk about, now we got a bill there trying to make us look racist, everybody. We really ought to vote that amendment down. Wasn't clear how it was going to go. It did ultimately, the voters did approve the amendment and invalidating that it was a crime for black and white to marry and to cohabitate in Alabama. But it was narrow, and there were actually many counties where it failed. Many counties. So white supremacy, you see, white nationalism, this sense of whiteness as something so operative in people's lives, maybe you take it for granted, you know, we're over that. We white people, we're over that here in Massachusetts. I don't know. But where I've lived, Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, let me tell you, it is essential. It is not taken for granted. It's who they are. And people are mobilized around it, and people are organized around it in very, very real and meaningful ways. Ways that I think account for how, in these same areas, these are supposedly such great Bible-thumping people, and yet they can be moved against their own biblical, moral ideals to back a Roy Moore, child molester, to back a Trump, a vowed rapist. Because what? Because he represents, he's like us. He's going to protect us. He's going to defend us. He's going to defend our whiteness. He's proud of his whiteness. I love him for that. How do you start a conversation that says, you know what, nobody's trying to take your whiteness from you, but we're saying that that whiteness has done some real wrong. And that if we're going to create a possibility where we can either, one, leave all the whiteness, blackness, and everything behind and just be human beings, just be people with each other, or alternatively, have a form of blackness, forms of blackness and forms of whiteness where we're not always at each other's throat, then this is a framework for it. Let's acknowledge the wrong that whiteness has done to blackness. Let's compensate for it, and let's try to build toward a situation. What Darity particularly calls for is that African Americans are, and we'll see with 2020 census if anything changed, but let's say roughly 13% of the country. What percentage are we of the country's wealth? Do we own of the country's wealth? 3%. If we could get that to 13, it could have tremendous benefits for the country, for white people, economically, policy-wise. It could have tremendous benefits for the country as a whole, all people in the country. And the kinds of arguments behind this are the same arguments that were behind fighting Jim Crow. If black people get sick, if in their general state of unhealthiness, pandemic disease like the coronavirus or something spreads amongst them, you think it's going to just stay with black people? So you don't need any part of your society to be so vulnerable and so poor and so uneducated. Raise them up, close the wealth gap between black and white, and you've got a healthier black people. You've got a more sophisticated black people better able to take care of themselves, and that won't threaten your own health and your own public safety. Same sorts of arguments can be made about reparations, about closing the wealth gap in some of the ways. But for me, it's really more of how it can allow us to challenge the white identity that was created by slavery, and to either allow space for whites to create a new form of white identity that extends freedom and extends humanity to black people, or, as I said, allows us to maybe look at how to drop the whole whiteness, blackness, race thing altogether. I think that is a project, but I think that's a project over a long time to come. Long time to come. I can't believe that my children's peers can get into the white nationalism and the white ideas and the neo-Nazism and things. My little 15-year-old kid, he's got peers, white peers, that are attracted to that. I can't believe it. Wait, you play together, you've gone to school together, you do this together, you do that, and they still go off and do this stuff? How? Why? How are you threatening them? What are you doing to them? What are you doing? I was like, what are you doing, son? No, I mean, how does that even happen? But to me, it's because the overarching culture, the overarching system of ideas of racecraft in this country have never been successfully challenged and dismantled. Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement gave great rhetoric and great efforts against it that made some progress, but then you had backlash. The backlash came immediately in the 70s. The backlash came triumphantly in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and has cycled us right back into steady state with the level of racecraft in this country.
How do you see reparations being implemented? Would it be a single payer thing? Would it be something that would...
Can you talk up louder, please?
How would the reparations be implemented?
And I can
Would
restate
it be
it.
a single payer? Would it be something that people could pool their money? And don't you expect some kind of backlash from that?
The question being how, or what are certain kinds of compensatory possibilities and proposals that are out there, and can there be backlash to that? There are a number of proposals. I'm not committed to any specific set or that people have put out there. And I'm not against any of the ideas, whether straight up $20,000 check in the mail, like was done with the Japanese, or whatever that figure might be, to each individual with ancestry whose ancestors had been enslaved, whether it's more cooperative, collaborative kinds of projects. I think that's what we've got to study. And that's what we have to look at. What are the potential pitfalls? What are the potential ways in which this can be siphoned, have negative ramifications of whatever forms. I think that's exactly the kinds of things we have to systematically study, because I could tell you about one thing I think is great, but until we really find ways to think it through, analyze it carefully, pilot some things, and see what the repercussions could be, we don't know. So, but I will tell you one thing, quite apart from the House bill and what we could do on a federal level. I think it's actually important on local and institutional levels to begin to grapple with reparations. We have companies in this country that their capital base goes back to, insurance companies, for example, that go back to when they insured slavery. They insured slaveholders.
For the ships.
For the ships, for their property. Okay? And out of that material, and the wealth created from that, that company exists till today. How does that institution critique itself? Let's look at in higher ed. Brown University owned enslaved African people, invested in the slave trade and the enslavement of African people. Its endowment today that funds the running of that institution has roots in slavery. Under Ruth Simmons, formerly president of Smith College, she convened a study. She commissioned a study. And folks looked at it. And she convened conversations with alums, with powerful alumni of the school, with the faculty of the school, with the current students of the school, with other stakeholders, and said, what do we do about this history? What do we do about, what's our responsibility? How do we repair the damage that this very institution benefited from? What do we do about it? And important steps were made from there, affecting the curriculum for all the students, affecting the possibilities for people to go there who financially could not afford to go there in many different ways. Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., similar background, similar process. Commissioned a study, looked at what they could do about it, and now have scholarships, and now have other kinds, the Africana Studies program department there, other kinds of things that they put money where their mouth is. They put behind changing the culture of the campus, acknowledging redress and compensation. And other universities are following suit. University of Alabama, where I taught. Now, small step, but again, everything's a step. They would take you around the campus. They'd show you the president's mansion, one of the few buildings that wasn't burned down by Sherman's March to the Sea when they came through Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and they're so proud, and you can revel in the architecture. Slave quarters right there in back of the house. Never mentioned. Never brought up on the little campus tours. They now do. They acknowledge that the campus owned African people. The campus supported the Confederacy. The campus, in later years, different things that it had done. The unmarked graves of some of the enslaved property were finally marked. It's right there on the campus where they were buried, where we knew they were buried, is now marked and acknowledged. The name, with their names, say their name, who had been enslaved. So acknowledgement, redress, compensation. So institutionally, there's work that can be done. Within our religious denominations, there's work that can be done. And even here, in Amherst, a little small case, but some years ago, marble tablets were created with all of the names of those who went to service and fought and died in the Civil War. Their names were put on these marble tablets, and they used to be on display in the town hall. They had kind of gotten yellowed, and particularly where they were, and they were going to do renovations, so they needed to clear everything out. Well, they took it down, they crated them up, they sent them to a company to be cleaned and preserved and taken care of. The company did it at great cost, and then crated it back up and mailed it back to the town of Amherst. And ever since then, over, I don't know, 20 years now, almost 20 years, they've never uncrated it and put them back in this place somewhere. They're just stuck in storage. We're raising. What about getting these back out in public view, in public display? Many of the people in there, some gave their lives for the cause. So also, do we have a Martin Luther King Boulevard in Greenfield?
No.
No, not yet.
You see, how are we acknowledging the folks from the other side that have fought to improve, to change this country? You know, we don't have it in Amherst. We don't have a single name of anybody of African descent anywhere. They tell me at one time there was a Henry Jackson Street. Jackson was served in the Civil War. He was known as a livery man, a truck man, very prominent. We got pictures of him. He was so loved in Amherst. And they had named the street, but then some things changed, and then it went back to Railroad Street. Can we get a Henry Jackson Street again? Can we get something that acknowledges Sojourner Truth? Something that acknowledges some of the local people who fought for freedom, who fought for a different kind of ideas, anti-racist ideas. Can we celebrate them and put them in the names?
Excuse me, I'd like to try and go in some order, and we have two people who had their hands up way long ago, then I'll come to you, okay?
Hi. I had a question actually similar to the last speaker. When I was studying reparations, I heard that it needed to be done at the institutional level, but in more recent years, I've been hearing about individual reparations. And I have a two-tiered question is, do you have any comments about the individual versus institutional type of reparations? And the second part of my question is how can people of European descent who benefit from white privilege support reparations individually or as groups and not like wait for the institutions to do it? I'm wondering if you have any comments on that.
So for me, I see reparations as part of an arc of justice. I see it as a process. So yes, individuals. I think your being out here today is a down payment. I think it's a step. I think when you go and you read something, you know, and you study it and you discuss, is a step. You know, I think the kinds of things that I've done and work that I've put in is part of a step toward making that arc of justice. And yes, even into compensatory schemes, ways to raise our own funds and put them toward doing something. Yes, absolutely. Nothing to say a group can't endow a scholarship. I think it takes $20,000, $25,000 to endow a scholarship at an institution of higher ed, UMass, Tougaloo College in Mississippi, wherever you want, to endow a scholarship that can help someone. You know, you can lay out the stipulations of it, but to help someone be able to go to school who is a descendant of those who have been enslaved. You know, to reduce their indebtedness, to reduce their financial burdens, to be able to go to school. Individually, what's to stop that? Imari Obadeli had a brilliant proposal for a certain number of billions to go to historically black colleges, to create, expand their endowments, that they could have endowed professorships, get have top quality professors be supported there with academic research loads, 2 classes a semester, rather than, like when I worked there, 5 classes a semester. Yes, I worked at Prairie View A&M in Texas for a year. My load was 4 plus. I led a discussion group with first-year honors students reading Cornel West's book, Race Matters. It had come out that year. But that's a killer load. To say somebody then on top of that is supposed to be, at that time, writing a dissertation, or if I had been a full professor at that point, writing a book. That's a load that makes that impossible. Create an endowed chair that can allow top quality professors to be at a Prairie View A&M with a research load that allows them time to do research. So these are things individuals could contribute to that could go a long way toward rectifying and toward, redressing. I think right here.
Good. Sorry, right back here in the gentleman.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kara. I'm kind of zooming back out a little bit, and I'm curious for some of your thoughts on some of the thought leadership in Black conservative circles against reparations. I'm thinking of people like Thomas Sowell, steeped in economics, Coleman Hughes, coming more from a philosophical perspective. I'm curious where you find points of agreement with those perspectives, and also where your main points of contention are, and how you would address those points of contention in conversation.
Well, I'll give you one point of contention. And I've read a lot of Sowell's work. Sowell was another Black economist out of MIT. He was a little bit older than Sandy and my group. He had been there a little bit before them. But, a lot of smart man, a lot of interesting work. But John Hope Franklin. So that year I was at Prairie View, my dean said, let's write a grant and bring in an important Black historian, speaker. And so I helped her write the grant. So even though I wasn't on the faculty that next year, she asked me to come back to introduce him and whatnot. And so we brought John Hope Franklin to Prairie View A&M. We had gotten a grant, got a nice little stipend for him. He came, he spoke. It was around the time the Bosnia-Herzegovina stuff was going on. And so he was waxing all over the world and everything. Then he got to Q&A. And because I was there, and I was talking to students, it was like 98 or something, I can't remember. Bill Clinton was in office. We'd been talking with students about reparations. Imari Obadele was faculty at Prairie View when I was faculty there. That's where we really became close. We had met each other before then, but we became close that year at Prairie View, and that's where we started the book together. But, so our students were all primed up. So got to Q&A, and they asked him, Professor Franklin, you're one of the greatest historians. You're the dean of African American history. Speak to us of reparations for slavery. Why do you raise such a question like that? That's ridiculous. On the face of it. White people will have nothing to do with that. Why are we going to talk about something that has no chance of going anywhere in this country? So dismissive. So negative, so dismissive. Great intellectual, great mind like that. And he's on what you'd call the liberal persuasion, right? This is a man with C. Van Woodward were part of the historical team that helped to argue Brown v. Board of Ed in 1954. That helped to change our country a little bit. And then face backlash, it's all been turned back. But what could I agree with him on about this? Well, I didn't. And I stood my ground, my students stood their ground. And do you know what? I met him, I was with him, I taught 2 years in Oklahoma. And he had come to Tulsa, his home stomping ground. He was actually from, an interesting man. I don't know if you ever read his book, Mirror in America. But he grew up in an all-Black town. They called, I don't know if he was Redbud or if he was one of them. But it was Oklahoma had many all-Black towns. And that's where he grew up. The most stark division, social division in his life growing up wasn't black and white. It was Baptist and Methodist. Oh, yes. The Baptists hated, black Baptists hated the black Methodists, black Methodists hated the black Baptists. That was an interracial marriage. If a Baptist proposed to marry a Methodist, oh Lord, the world had ended. Oh my God, that was the worst political division in his little all-black town where he grew up. His dad, a lawyer, made money to support the family back there in that little black town, working in Tulsa. Had a law office, was really rising with the whole Black Wall Street, giving legal representation to the Black Wall Street people. 1921 comes along, black man stumbles, kind of getting on the elevator, maybe brushes a white female who's running the elevator shaft, word goes out he raped her. Locked the guy up, and he's a good guy, black and white, everybody knows that this man wouldn't hurt a fly, But then the black community heard this was going down, and some of these cats had been in World War I. They had weapons, they knew how to handle themselves. Said, no, we're not gonna let this go down. Started going downtown, brandishing their arms, talking about getting this man out of jail. Not gonna allow a mob to assemble to lynch him, which had just happened in Oklahoma City not long before. Wipe out the town. Ran all the black people out. They actually came back and rebuilt Greenwood, the Greenwood community, but that's another story. It was really fully destroyed by urban renewal in the 60s, but that's another story. Wiped them out. His own dad suffered, law office, burned up. Damages. Any compensation? No, they compensated white people. They compensated the trials and things afterwards where insurance companies didn't want to do it. They wanted to call it an act of God. And so people went to trial. It was no act of God. This was an act of a mob. This was and actually a mob deputized by law enforcement. Had been deputized. So they wanted reparations. Where was the black reparations? Nothing. Dr. Franklin was attracted to the cause because law professor Ogletree, Charles Ogletree out of Harvard, and some other law professor, a guy named Al Brophy that I was a colleague with at the University of Alabama, and other prominent lawyers started revisiting different kinds of cases and different issues, and particularly they revisited the Tulsa case, because you still had living survivors from 1921. And they said, okay, so people object because, everybody's dead. No, people are still alive who lost, who were damaged by that act, by that massacre. Pay reparations. First hurdle they faced, statute of limitations. You couldn't sue the state. So they said, well, let's get the state legislature to overrule that statute so that we could then have a trial. Wouldn't pass the legislature, end of reparations from the state of Oklahoma. But Dr. Franklin lent his name to the cause. He started turning around. And even before he died, even more generally than just the Tulsa case, he came to be a supporter of reparations, at least of the conversation for reparations. So I don't put a lot of stock in opposition, black opposition or white opposition. I think again, let's get this, let's study it, let's get this commission, let's study it, let's move forward, and we'll address the different opposition points as we go. But let me just add this in closing. If some of you all want to work on a local project acknowledging some history that hasn't been acknowledged, or a street renaming, or whatever it might be, again, any help that I can give to the effort, please call on me. Folks know how to reach me. I'd be glad to support. I think those are the certain little steps, in addition to individual reparation. These are things that as communities we can begin to do. I've been talking with our state legislators, Mindy Dom and others, Joe Comerford, to really think about a ballot measure where we might have a sense of the people of Massachusetts in support of say, House Bill 40 or in support of reparations in some form. Just something like that, whether we could say it's symbolic or it's a sense of the people, can go a long way toward showing leadership to the rest of our region, to New England, to the country as a whole, that can begin to shift the mindset. We win with little steps building toward something bigger. Little steps.
I have just a simple question. The House Bill 40. Why not a House Bill 40 for Massachusetts?
Exactly.
And get that passed, because that would be and it would be certainly much easier to get it passed in Massachusetts.
We're working on that.
We're working on it. That's the idea. That's exactly the idea.
That would work.
That's exactly the idea.
So we'd like to thank Dr. Shabazz for coming and being here with us.